Okay, you can go ahead and get started, Valerie.
All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the final workshop slash webinar in our series, Turning Good Intentions into Constructive Engagement on Race. The topic of today's session is contemporary social issues and the Latinx experience in the United States. This session will be led by Dr. Francisca Antman, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Colorado, Boulder. At this point, I think it's important that I take a step back. I recognize that we have a mixed audience today, and some of you may be confused by my introduction of this as the final workshop in a series. We actually began this workshop series in July 2019 as a series of in-person workshops, back in the good old days when we could actually be face-to-face with people, among a group of about 40 researchers and policy analysts from EPI and similar organizations here in Washington, D.C. Now, all of those who were invited to participate had expressed an interest in more effectively centering race and ethnicity in their work, but recognize that the cultural shift and implementation of doing that were challenging even despite the best of intentions. And so I partnered with Groundwork Collaborative and the Center for Popular Democracy to develop a format that would bridge the technical aspects of research and policy with the practical aspects of grassroots activism, especially as it relates to economic and racial justice. And so the goal of this series all along has been to educate, to challenge, and to equip participants to effectively use their work and expertise to expose and challenge social and economic structures and institutions that perpetuate racial inequality. Now, due to the pandemic, we put the series on hold just about a week before today's session was originally scheduled in March. So even if you aren't new to the series, we've been away for several months. And in the interest of sort of bringing everyone up to speed, we have compiled a about 13-minute, I think, video recap of the previous 6 in-person workshops that we will share with you. And after that, I'll get into introducing our speaker for today. So Nina, if we could bring that video recap up.
Even in some of our most prestigious, most heavily resourced institutions, our inability to talk about race is making us unable to serve the populations that we set out to serve. It is preventing us from coming up with real solutions to problems in today's society. So I'm sure that not all of you need me to tell you this, but if you're wondering, when does race have to do with what we're talking about? The answer is all the time.
The questions to ask is, how is race defined in this discussion? So whenever you see any racial analysis that is out there, the first thing to ask, given these definitions, is how are they defining race? Who are, and it might seem like an odd question, but you really want to ask, who are the white people? Who are the Black people? Who are the Asians? Who is Hispanic? Because that would be an ethnic designation. And what races are they including in that Hispanic designation? Who are the Pacific Islanders, et cetera, et cetera? And then is there any thinking about heterogeneity within that racial classification, or are they only reporting differences, average differences between members of the groups? Typically, they're reporting average differences between members of the group, which is fine. But a question that you might want to ask for policy is the underlying variance or the underlying distribution within those racial categories themselves. And next, are we assuming a group or basically an average of individuals framework, right? So you shouldn't run any empirical analysis without some idea or some theoretical model behind it. Are you running an egocentric model? If you're thinking about when economists talk about this, it's almost always going to be an egocentric model. Others are thinking about relations between groups, and it's important for them to think about those frameworks, specifically as they're thinking about policy and the role for policy for them. And then how do the questions and answers to those questions inform the interpretation that we would have of the results?
But I would speculate that, in that case, if part of your premise is that the data simply isn't there or isn't really credible because of the sample sizes, that's a very good opportunity for, grassroots kinds of organizing and research activities themselves. So, so one mode is to kind of rely on authoritative institutions to tell stories about us. And then the other mode is for us to be able to tell our own stories. And this is where, this participatory action research comes into play, which is not, something that I suggest lightly because it is very expensive and very hard to do well. But it is, in this process, people who are, affected by this particular issue come together to gather data about themselves and their own circumstances. And they do so kind of with the support and guidance of people who are trained in kind of, research methods so that to kind of lend it some credibility for external observers. And then actually not only the action part of it comes in the fact that because they're actors in their own lives, they are in a position to kind of act immediately upon seeing this information that they're producing themselves.
One of the things that you might hear is this, it's really this conflation of statistical significance with general importance. And those are two very different sorts of things. So in a place that is relatively small, you won't have a large N, but that is the N that exists, right? So statistical significance only matters if you're running a statistical test. And so if you're thinking about policy, it might not have any say in the discussion or the policy discussion. If you want to target, say, an immigrant population in Nebraska or an immigrant population in Maine.
Often we get lots of requests that don't feel well thought out. And folks reach out and they are looking to engage in a particular, very narrow piece of research. And they want to convene a focus group next month or in 3 weeks. And they're wondering, can we host it in your space? Oh, and by the way, will you be able to provide interpretation? Because, a large majority of your members are monolingual Spanish speakers. We know that. But we're hoping you'll have some organizers that can be there to share, to be able to interpret. And no mention of Metro cards, no mention of compensation. Maybe there's a $10 or $15 or $25 gift card to somewhere. But a real lack of valuing us as an organization or just the people that you are trying to engage with.
You may not individually, but your organizations have a lot of power, right? Like your organizations are developing research and data that just through your organization, that research and data going to a legislator could turn into like the drafting of federal policy, right? Like we talked about, for our organizing, our power, that we are constantly in communities connecting with as many people as possible, because for us to exercise power down here, we are getting up in the morning at 3 a.m. and bringing busloads of people down here to even show the people down here that are crafting policy that we matter, right? Your organizations can email some data or research to a legislator that then could turn into policy that impacts the rest of our lives. And so, Make the Road for a nonprofit, we're also kind of a larger organization. And so with that, we understand that like shifting the culture, transforming the culture of an organization is a long-term process, but you all should be grounded in the outsized power and influence that many of your organizations have on crafting policies that impact the lives of millions of people.
While we are here for constructive conversation, engagement around race, Native American people and Native tribal nations are not racial designations. And hopefully through the conversation today, we'll be able to distinguish and come away with that it's a political relationship that Native peoples have, Native tribal nations have with the federal government. Reparations for American Indians and Alaska Natives, for Indigenous people is really wound up in this political history, because there has been the takings of the land, the taking of sort of the identity, the boarding schools, the taking of the economy and the subsistence. What we have found, and this is really, I think, remarkable, is that the work of American Indians through the legal system, especially, as I was saying earlier, the Native American Rights Fund started in the early 70s, coming out of the civil rights movement, to try to enforce those treaties as the highest law of the land. These are legal obligations, and that was firmly establishing the different rights, legal rights, one to exist, one to have standing in the court, and one to actually get compensation for that loss.
You know, like we talk about policy all the time. And how do we make sure that when we actually make concessions, because we know that, you know, we come up with like the perfect policy, but there's always going to be compromises. And who has to be on the table when those compromises are made? And we know that people in our community, they're the experts of their lives, of our lives, so that they know what will work, what wouldn't work. And I think in that process too, we can never rely on government to enforce policies. But then if the community is in the forefront, when we are crafting these policies, when we are compromising, once it passed, you know, people are going to be like, well, we know that you're supposed to do this, so that we don't have to worry so much about enforcement.
A lot of people, including Asian Americans, believe that Asian Americans demonstrate higher test scores than other groups on average because of cultural values, that they care more about education or that they have a special value for education. This is highly tenacious and internalized kind of assumption within the Asian American community, and many of you have heard of the stereotype it's associated with, the model minority stereotype. What that stereotype doesn't capture is that most Asian Americans arrived since the 1990s. The vast majority, over half the population of Asian Americans, have arrived since the 1990s. That's exactly when the US started to ramp up H-1B visas. And what US immigration policy has done is, for some of these groups, the groups that coincidentally or not so demonstrate the highest test scores, is to engage in what we call in Asian American studies hyperselectivity of certain Asian immigrant groups. That is, the immigrants that are coming to the US are not only much more highly educated than people in the US in general, they're also more highly educated than people in their countries of origin.
Important point. So we have to do things like relational organizing. I know a lot of funders love the term relational organizing. It's like a new buzzword. There's no one on earth that can't tell me that Harriet Tubman was not doing relational organizing. It's not new. It's how we authentically engage with our folks, understanding the structural barriers that we have to deal with. We have to expand the idea of civic engagement outside of just voting. If we are thinking of civic engagement as just voting, you're leaving out all the people that are on paper that haven't had their voting rights restored yet. You're leaving out undocumented folks. You're leaving out whole groups of people, and we're sending the message that you are only as valuable as your ability to vote in this political system. We're centering those directly impacted. I mentioned that a lot of folks come from the zip code that we are housed in, and a lot of the issues that we talk to and the issues that we face and the issues that we hear from residents on a daily basis, those are the same issues that we hear about. When there's a tragedy that is happening, or a couple weeks ago, there was a lot of domestic violence issues that kind of rocked our city, being able to be from the community and being able to talk about those things, all the issues that we hear on doors are our issues because we are also a part of the same community that we're organizing. And I always throw in there, I heard this, somebody said this, it was so profound, and I said it and it stuck with me. You can't organize Black people if you don't love Black people.
So the first thing is to identify common ground. And what I would say common ground is that we're all Black. That's just what it is. And so to be in America, that means that you're on the outside, and that's what it is. And we have to actually think about the fact that, hey, I may not necessarily agree with what he's saying fully, but I actually know what it feels like for someone to be a lawyer. I'm not a lawyer, but I know what it feels like to be at a job where people assume that you're only hired because you're a token, which is something that he actually talked about. Right? Know what it feels like to actually say, hey, listen, father was actually killed by senseless violence. And it sucks that actually happened to our own community. Our own community did it to us, right? Or again, to have somebody that actually says, hey, trying to make $1 out of 15 cents. It's hard to be legit, trying to pay your rent, right? Actually realizing that we actually shift between this. You're not always extroverted. You're not always ambiverted. We actually share a common ground, which again, which connects us to being Black.
I think it's important in this country to understand race as foundational in this country, and race being founded upon this concept of Blackness that actually was crafted and designed to give significance and meaning to whiteness. And so as we move forward in our work, I think it's important that we consider all the ways that I mentioned some of the terms that Blackness gets invoked, even without saying it, or just the way that we've been conditioned to form an image mentally just from the mentioning of a word or an incident or something. And to really be more intentional, introspective about how we do our work, the language that we use, how we get to know people, and understanding and sharing our stories and really connecting.
So that is a quick 13-minute recap of all of the previous 6 sessions. We have posted a link to the full recordings in the chat for those of you who are interested in watching those in full. There was a lot of valuable information provided in those, indeed. As we prepare for today's webinar on the Latinx, Latino, or Hispanic experience in the United States, we wanted to start with a quick poll or sort of quiz before we get started with the larger presentation. So if we could bring that up now, Nina. So the question that's being posed here, for each of these examples, we're asking if you can identify for which of the following individuals, all of whom live in the United States, which would be considered to be Hispanic per most US surveys. And so for each of the options, you can select either this person would be identified as Hispanic, this person would not be identified as Hispanic, or not sure how that person would be identified. So I'll give you a few seconds, minutes to read through each of those and enter your responses. While you are doing that, I will take this time to briefly introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Francisca Antman, and I will turn things over to her to answer those burning questions in the poll and many more. But Francisca Antman is Associate Professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Colorado in Boulder. She is a development and labor economist by training, but some of her recent projects explore the construction of race and ethnic identity, as well as economic development in historical perspective. Now, on a personal note, Francisca and I first became acquainted, I guess it was about 6 years ago, when a mutual colleague, Dr. Marie Mora, introduced us. At that time, Francisca was a member of the American Economic Association Committee on the Status of Minority Groups in the Economics Profession. Now that's a mouthful. But the purpose of our introduction was that Francisca was seeking a non-academic economist and person of color to feature in the group's newsletter. That person turned out to be me. So when I was seeking a speaker for this session, Marie once again put us in touch with each other. And so now I get the privilege of featuring the outstanding work of a sister economist and woman of color, Dr. Francisca Antman. I'll turn the program over to her now to answer that poll and respond to provide some additional information for our webinar today.
Well, thank you so much, Valerie. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for that introduction, and thank you, Marie, wherever you are. Yes, so I am also now the co-director of the American Economic Association mentoring program that mentors graduate students of color to get through to try to diversify the economics profession. Actually, the director is Trevon Logan, who was featured in your video. So it was really it really is a pleasure to be among friends here. And I will say about the poll, I don't know if we're featuring the results of the poll, but
yeah, I can. Are you ready?
Yeah, or whenever you'd like. Yeah, we can go ahead and do that first before I. Great. Okay. Well, thank you for responding to this this poll. So, kind of put in a collection of different backgrounds, and it's interesting to see, you know, the not sure responses. I think are coming from a place where a lot of people are not sure, and those are kinds of the topics that we are going to be approaching today. So it seems like the most people who were sure were that an unauthorized immigrant from Mexico would be considered Hispanic. But, you know, for a man born in Chicago whose great grandparents were from Spain, you know, maybe we're not about even in terms of Hispanic versus not Hispanic. So the answer really to the question is, according to most US surveys, that everyone who self-identifies as Hispanic is considered Hispanic in the US population. So all of these people, as long as they put down on, you know, the census form or multitude of other surveys that use this Hispanic origin question that we're going to talk about today, as long as they say that they respond affirmatively, that they self-identify as Hispanic, they would be counted as Hispanic. And we're going to dig deeper into those kinds of questions now. So I'll go ahead and share screen now. And so these are the slides I've prepared today. And we're going to go through, you know, a lot of topics, an overview. Let me get this to full screen here. Everybody can see my slides, yes? Okay, great. So the title of this talk is Contemporary Social Issues and the Latinx Experience in the United States, but we're going to be talking in part about identity, a topic that's very close to my own research, and I've done a lot of research on racial and ethnic identity for different groups. And in particular, the term Latinx, which I certainly embrace the spirit of inclusion. You know, in my own life, certainly as an educator, we use the term extensively, but throughout the talk, I'm going to use the terms Hispanic, Latino, and Latinx interchangeably, in part because Latinx is not widely adopted, not a widely adopted term in terms of how Latinos identify themselves. And we'll talk about those issues as well. But I also want to be respectful of how people want to identify themselves. So we're going to use some of those terms interchangeably. And of course, because I'm an economist by training, I'm going to focus a lot on economic outcomes. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to begin, just to give you an outline of what I'm going to try to cover today. We're going to begin with just a portrait of who makes up the US Hispanic, Latino, Latinx population. So some important definitions and a statistical portrait. Much of this is going to be very familiar to experts, certainly experts in the field, but just so we all have a, you know, kind of a same starting point to frame our discussion in this idea of what do we really need to know? What would everybody really need to know if they were really going to better understand this population in the US? So these kinds of basic statistics. And then I'll talk about longstanding issues affecting this community. So immigration policy and enforcement, that is kind of one of the nuances of this population, is that they're a very diverse group, and certainly immigration status, time in the US, things like that, they add a lot of, also a lot of variation to this group, and also issues of assimilation and what we call in the economics literature, ethnic attrition. So that people who might be Hispanic by ancestry in terms of their descendants, that they are descendants of Hispanic immigrants, but no longer identify or don't identify as Hispanic. And that term was sort of adopted by Stephen Trejo, for those economists in the room, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. And then in closing, I'd like to talk a little bit about the historical experience of the US Hispanic population, some of my own more recent research that I have with Galena Cortez at Texas A&M, in particular about actual segregation in the specifically in California, but segregation of schools in the United States, and how that desegregation affected educational outcomes for this population. And that's sort of a lesser known part of history that a lot of people, even Latinos themselves, don't know about. A lot of, and also brings a lot of commonalities with other populations in the United States, similarly with African Americans and also Native Americans, who were also segregated into different schools. And then if we have some time, and certainly in the Q&A, we can talk about the very important disparate impacts on the Hispanic population in the COVID-19 era. I know EPI has done a lot of work in this area already, so but we can certainly talk about that more in the discussion. Okay, so who are Hispanic individuals? Well, as I said in response to the poll, the answer really is based on responses to this Hispanic, what we call the Hispanic origin question, that is very common on many US surveys. And it's just asking whether this person, or if you are the one filling out the survey, are you of Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? Importantly, that's separate from the race question on any type of recent survey, for the most part. So large scale surveys typically also ask a separate race question. What is this person's race? So responses to both of these, the Hispanic origin question and the race question, really focus on self-identification. If you read the instructions to the survey, the designers of the survey are really emphasizing that the answer to this question, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. It is how you self-identify, how the respondent how the person identifies themselves. So what this means is that Hispanic Latinos can certainly be of any race. And I will also say that there is additional nuance here, because the race question also allows people to fill in a category of other. And in recent years, certainly many people have been filling out the most popular responses. There have been people filling out Hispanic origin type of responses into that race question. So this feeling, certainly by a certain portion of the population, that ethnicity, Hispanic ethnicity in particular, has become racialized. So this distinction that has been made may not be felt among certain members of the population, and there may be other differences that might help to explain why that is. There are also other questions that are sometimes asked that we might define as researchers as more objective measures of ancestry. So they may ask specifically about what is your ancestry or ethnic origin. They might ask about parents' country of birth, those kinds of questions. So this is just what the census form looks like, and the emphasis to answer both questions about race and Hispanic origin. So, and you'll see that the top three answers also allow people to say Mexican American population, Puerto Rican, and Cuban, and those are the three largest origins within that Hispanic classification. So since we're talking about immigrants as well, immigrants as a portion of this Hispanic population, or that importance of that immigrant experience, another important defining characteristics is generation. So first generation Hispanics are defined as that foreign-born population. So again, that identify as Hispanic. They were not born in the US, they're immigrants themselves. And they're just over a third of the population. And the second generation is about a third as well, and a third of the population. So those are US born children with at least one immigrant parent. And then the third and higher order generations are US-born children of US-born parents, so no foreign-born parents, but they again define themselves, are self-identified as Hispanic. So those are, and those proportions are from some recent numbers, recent analysis by the Pew Research Center. So self-identification of these immigrant generations. So you can see that here, Pew Research, which really tracks the Hispanic population in the US very well and is really providing a lot of the survey and analysis of recent statistics. You can see that the share that identifies as Hispanic or Latino falls considerably across immigrant generations. And this goes back to my discussion of ethnic attrition. So what you can see is that by the fourth or higher generation, only about half of those individuals, those US adults who have Hispanic ancestry, so they're asked about whether they have Hispanic ancestry, only about half are actually identifying as Hispanic. So what this really means is that there is actually, if you were going to construct a measure of Hispanics in the US population based on ancestry, it would be significantly larger than the population that we perceive, that we, that I'm going to talk about in a second, that's based on self-identification. So it would be much bigger. Importantly, it's also because we base our definitions of Hispanic identity on self-identification, we are also skewing it in a selected way, right? Because that selection into Hispanic identification might be skewed toward specific socioeconomic groups. We're going to talk more about that as well. So Hispanics, again, by going by the definition we started with, people who self-identify as Hispanic, and they have been a very fast-growing portion of the U.S. population. So Pew, again, analysis of Census Bureau data, there are about 61 million in 2019. Here's the census picture themselves, and it's about 18.5% of the population. So they're the single largest minority ethnic group in the United States. They're also disproportionately represented in certain geographical regions. So you can see here on the right, you see the states, the distribution of the nation's populations. This is from 2011, but so it's shifted a little bit since then. In 2019, though, you can see, the counties that have the highest shares of the population that's Hispanic. They are in those states that are represented here on the right here: California, Texas, Florida, Arizona, so the Southwest, Florida. And it also depends on country of origin, right? So we see more representation of Mexican-American Hispanics along the Southwest. We see a higher representation of Cuban Americans in Florida. And I just wanted to put in this other graphic from William Frey from Brookings, where he's also charting growth of Hispanic populations. So you can see that actually, even though we have those typical population centers that we just talked about, and this is these are the metro areas with the largest shares. Those are kind of the orange circles, but the green circles represent growth. And you see that Hispanic growth in population is much more dispersed across the country. So in terms of terminologies, how I was talking at the start about using this Latinx, the use of this Latinx term. Pew recently had a very nice, interesting article summarizing their analysis of this national survey of Latinos. And you can see on the right here that most Latino adults have not heard of the term Latinx, and very few use it, only about 3% according to their analysis. What you do see much more often is that Latinos are using country of heritage to describe their own identities. So some might use Hispanic or Latino. So if you look at the top bar on the left here, among all Hispanics, they about almost 40% are using the term Hispanic or Latino, but 47% are using their country of heritage. So do they identify as Mexican or Mexican American, or do they identify as Hispanic or Latino? Among the foreign born, as you might expect, it's even a larger share, and that begins to decline across immigrant generation. So language use is another varied, adds another level of nuance to this, these questions of identity of Hispanics in the population. So English proficiency, which is often discussed in popular media circles about the degree to which Hispanics are using English or able to communicate proficiently in English, that certainly has been rising over time. English proficiency rises also across generations, as you might expect, with about 90% of US-born Hispanics being proficient in English. That's only true of about 37% of Latino immigrants. At the same time, Spanish language proficiency actually falls, and it falls substantially by immigrant generation. So certainly in terms of language, we certainly see what you might think of as converging on US norms in terms of the use of English among individuals that are born in this country. In terms of Hispanic origin groups, I talked about this a little bit already, but the largest country of origin group is made up of Mexicans. Mexican or Mexican Americans, about 62%, followed by Puerto Rican, and then followed by Cuban. So 61.9%, that's really, a very large share of Hispanic groups in the United States, share of the Hispanic total in the United States. So in much of the literature, you do see people then focus on Mexicans in particular. So because there is such a diversity of the population of Hispanics, sometimes you see researchers focus specifically on Mexicans because they are such a large share of the population. And this graphic here is from an EPI report, actually looking at age distribution, so other demographic characteristics of the population here, and they skew young compared to the white age distribution. They're a younger population on average. Some other characteristics, they're less likely to have access to healthcare. This certainly comes into play in the current COVID-19 pandemic and disparate issues of disparate impacts on this population. They're also likely to have higher fertility rates. So they tend to have higher fertility rates, even though that has been declining more recently. And in terms of socioeconomic status, this also is from, on the left here, is from the EPI. They have lower incomes and higher rates of poverty than white households. So they're certainly more vulnerable in that sense as well. Here, these are BLS numbers on the median usual weekly earnings. You can see in comparison, Hispanics $680 versus about $916 for whites. That's earnings. And more BLS statistics here in terms of educational attainment. You can see on the left, the graphic shows those with less than a high school diploma in gray. And you can see that Hispanics, Hispanic Latinos, they're more likely to be in that category of having less than a high school diploma relative to the other populations, relative to whites, African Americans, or Asians. So they're more likely to have less than a high school degree, and they're less likely to have an advanced degree, a bachelor's degree or higher, represented by the blue bars here. In terms of occupation, they're more likely to work in service occupations. So those are the yellow bars here, and Hispanics are all the way at the right edge, or the rightmost bar here. So they're more likely to work in service occupations, and they're less likely to work in management or professional occupations relative to white non-Hispanic whites. And This again comes into play when we think about the impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic, because they are in occupations that are more likely to be affected in terms of shutdowns, in county or local area shutdowns, as well as declining demand for service, hospitality sector, those kinds of things. And one thing that is often noted about the Hispanic population is that they have very high labor force participation rates. So that means they're also, they're either employed or they're unemployed and looking for work. So they have very high, they're among the highest of all the racial ethnic groups. And they, but, you know, similar to African Americans, they are more, impacted by recessions, right? So you can see that they tend to have higher unemployment rates. This graphic on the left from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they tend to have higher rates of unemployment, and certainly are more adversely impacted during recessions, which are all those, you know, increases in unemployment there. And then finally, what we have been discussing of late, this the Latino vote. So of course we just had an election here, presidential election, and there was a lot of discussion running up to it about Latino vote and whether they were going to essentially break for Democrats or Republicans, those kinds of things. We can leave for the discussion essentially, you know, how the media in particular, what they made of essentially the outcomes of the election, in particular this notion of the Latino vote. But you might have expected that, given the diversity of Hispanic backgrounds, origins, geographical regions, that they are really not monolithic in their viewpoints either. And this, so, you know, this idea that they would be this kind of one single vote is maybe, you know, is far-fetched kind of at the outset. But in any case, this very nice interactive map that I encourage you to see at Pew Research that they did kind of in advance of the election, sort of looking at the percent of eligible voters who are Hispanic, you can see that they're in the, the darker shaded areas, or the higher shares of percent eligible voters that are Hispanic. You can see that they're really have the potential to have a big impact on elections in California, in Texas, in New Mexico, Arizona, Florida, Nevada, a lot of the places that we heard about certainly in the aftermath of the election. Pew has also done this very interesting, has I think made this really important contribution that I hope that we have a chance to discuss more for those of you who are interested. But one thing that we don't talk about that much, because it's not collected on a lot of the surveys that economists like me analyze, on the vast majority of surveys are not collecting anything on skin color. But Pew did that, did an analysis of that on one of their recent surveys. And they're actually looking at skin color. So the respondent would be encouraged to compare their hand with one of these hands here, to compare to show, you know, to see which one best matches their own. So this is in the style of the New Immigrant Survey, for those of you who are familiar with it. But it's interesting that it's collected for all, you know, of the population of Hispanic adults. And you can see that they're really falling into these two categories on you know, the lighter skin color group and the darker skin color group. They're really here. So I think, you know, thinking about how skin color might be related to identity is also, I think, adds an important complexity dimension that we really just don't have the capacity to analyze, given the state of surveys in, you know, the nationally representative surveys available to us. And certainly most, I think, as you might expect, as most people might expect, many of the people with darker skin color had more experience of discrimination, but it wasn't then relative to the people with lighter skin color, but it wasn't necessarily as dramatic as you might have thought. And the percent of Hispanics that have experienced discrimination, at least from time to time, is significant. So discrimination is a factor for this population, even if it is some kind of discrimination, such as based on language or accent, something related to that. And finally, undocumented immigrants. So Pew calculates the undocumented immigrants, the number of undocumented immigrants in the United States, or unauthorized immigrants in the United States, using this residual method. So they're comparing our estimates of the foreign-born population and subtracting out estimates of essentially those lawful immigrants among that population. There's certainly adjustments that need to be made, because you might think undocumented or unauthorized immigrants are less likely to be counted in those surveys, things like that. But they make calculations about the size of the undocumented population, and you can see it rising and essentially falling over the last recession. So you can see in these numbers here on the right that Mexico in particular looks like has had a decrease in that population. But it declines for Mexico population. We've seen increases in unauthorized immigrants from the Northern Triangle countries, which are experiencing a lot of violence and unrest, regime change, instability, gangs, all of those things. So that population has shifted a little bit, but I do want to emphasize that in 2018, about the vast majority of Latinos in the US were citizens. Okay, so having gone through that statistical portrait, I'm just going to get into some of the issues that are facing the population. So because of that immigrant experience, even across that connection through immigrant generations, there has been a lot of attention paid, certainly by economists, to policies and immigration enforcement mechanisms that have been enacted over the past 40 years. So some examples of that, there are many. The Immigration Reform and Control Act, certainly with that path to citizenship in 1986. But since then, there have been even more executive order style policy or de facto style policies with very sudden change that have not had the same kind of legal essentially buildup. They're sort of enacted suddenly. So that includes the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals under President Obama, Secure Communities program, immigration raids, sanctuary cities, E-Verify, and in general, research finds that, as you might expect, negative impacts of these stricter immigration enforcement measures, the stricter immigration enforcement measures have negative impacts on health, labor force outcomes for likely unauthorized immigrants, and positive impacts on the individuals eligible for these programs on work and education outcomes. So I will say that there's much, much more work to do. The current and outgoing administration has enacted a lot of policies that really were, sudden and certainly drew a lot of media attention, but we just haven't had the time to really be able to analyze it, to get the data to analyze it. But I expect we'll, be seeing this for many years to come. And that includes a lot of these border closure measures, curbs and limits on asylum applications, family separation policies, expedited deportations. We've seen so many of these over the past 4 years that I expect we will be, have a very big research pipeline to estimate these very potentially, extremely adverse consequences of these kinds of policies. So I have some work on this as well. And so I'm just going to summarize some of my work here, looking at the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals policy in particular, the DACA policy, which was really focused on immigrants that arrived in childhood. It had a whole set of eligibility criteria that allow researchers to essentially leverage those eligibility thresholds to look at people who were just on one or the other side of these kinds of cutoffs, to construct comparison groups and look at their impacts. I'll just focus here on the impact on poverty, and this was with joint work. This is joint work with Catalina Muedo-Dorantes, who's at UC Merced now. And what we find is a big decline in the population of likely eligible DACA-headed households that were living in poverty as a result of this policy. We also find some other impacts on school enrollment. Actually, we find some evidence of declines in school enrollment because it looks like potentially they were shifting into employment occupations. We also have some work, again, Catalina Muedo-Dorantes and I, on de facto immigration enforcement, awareness of ICE raids, and worker engagement. And here we're using the actual removals data, as well as Google Trends data on searches for ICE raids. So the extent to which in a locality they were looking for, they were searching for these terms, these search terms. They are positively correlated with ICE raids themselves. We did get some ICE raids from Freedom of Information Act requests. Both of these measures are positively correlated with ICE raids. And what we find is that deportations are associated with reductions in the labor force participation and employment of likely undocumented immigrants that are still here. So as a measure of those, the kind of fear that those kinds of deportations might engender, basically. And we find very strong effects among women in particular, even after controlling for a lot of the de jure immigration policies at the time. We didn't find really much of an effect of the actual Google search terms, and that could be because they're really being embodied in the kinds of removals, especially immigration-related removals, where the worst offense is just being in the country without documentation, that might be the biggest impact. I will say a little bit about assimilation and ethnic attrition across generations. I did say a little bit about this already, but basically, there's a large literature that examines why we have persistent gaps between non-Hispanic whites and Hispanic whites over generations. Some of the evidence that we saw at the top of this presentation. Most studies, however, are missing these ethnic attritors, as I said before. And Duncan and Trejo, Brian Duncan and Steve Trejo, document this pattern of selective ethnic attrition, whereby better educated descendants are actually less likely to identify as Mexicans. So essentially, we're getting a skewed portrait of our progress for this group because of this differential identification, self-identification. We've done a little bit of this work in health as well. I, along with Steve Trejo and Brian Duncan, looking at essentially health, whether there's some kind of ethnic attrition pattern in health that could in part address this issue of the Hispanic health paradox. In the public health literature, we see that there is some evidence that Hispanic immigrants have better health outcomes than non-Hispanic whites, and some evidence that at least on some outcomes, they have better health outcomes than Hispanic US natives. So something like a declining immigrant health advantage. There's been a lot of research investigating why that is. And I just put that out there as well, and we might discuss this, but that might, some of that might be essentially the root cause, some of those root causes, let's say, something like a protective immigrant sociocultural environment, community, things like that, might help shield Latinos from what otherwise might be even worse impacts from the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's something that's also been circulating among media circles. I'm going to skip this, the specific results here, but we do find that ethnic attrition is also selective on health. So ethnic attriters generally look like they are in better health than non-attriters. And we also see intermarriage is selective on health. The historical experience, finally, the historical experience of the Latinx population. So this is, I think, where there's a lot more work to be done. Certainly in economics, most economics research really focuses on the current experience, with a lot of the research really focusing on unauthorized immigrants and the impacts of immigration on natives. But it really ignores the fact that Latinx communities have been in these geographical regions for generations, and there are longstanding structural discrimination mechanisms against Hispanics that are really often largely ignored. So that kind of long arc of history is really understudied, certainly from a quantitative perspective. There's certainly a lot of historical evidence documenting that in historical studies, but we have less quantitative data on it, and that's what we're trying to contribute here. So I won't go through this paper here, but basically there are a lot of similarities with Brown v. Board of Education. In this particular court case, Mendez v. Westminster, that I analyze here with my co-author, Galena Cortez at Texas A&M, looking at this Mendez v. Westminster court case that came before Brown, has a lot of similarities, a lot of similar players, and is a really interesting picture into desegregation of Mexican schools, which were erected in California at the time. So here you see a quote: "In response to the demand, a small frame building was erected behind the main elementary school building. Here, all the Mexican and Mexican-American children were housed." So there is a lot of historical evidence of this, and we basically try to identify which counties were in California were more likely to be segregating using some historical censuses. And what we find, comparing Hispanic individuals that were essentially start school after this desegregation court ruling comes into play in counties that were more or less likely to be segregated, what we find is that school desegregation significantly improved the educational outcomes for Mexican Americans. We see an increase of almost a full year of completed schooling in more likely segregated counties compared with less segregated counties for cohorts starting school after the court decision relative to cohorts that started earlier. So really a big impact of desegregation. And you can sort of see that here. The lowest blue line is the one that you can see rising, showing the steepest rise, those Hispanics in those high segregated counties that essentially, and you see a very steep rise for those who were young enough to really benefit from that. So I'll skip over this. We can take up the current issues affecting Latinos in our discussion, all the disparate effects for them. EPI has done some great work on that already. And just to conclude here, I just want to emphasize that of course, the Hispanic population in the U.S. is a large and growing share of the United States. They really represent individuals from diverse backgrounds and origins. They face many challenges, some owing to their immigrant status or unauthorized status. They face challenges of discrimination and socioeconomic status. And these issues surrounding self-identification make really tracking the population more difficult. So really improving our surveys along those measures would be really helpful. Having more of those objective indicators of ancestry would be helpful in order to document progress as well as ongoing disparities.
All right. Well, thank you. That was a lot of useful information, a lot of information. I think for some of it may have been familiar, but in particular, I think a lot of your own research that you highlighted around segregation, issues with the ICE raids, et cetera. I think would be of are of interest to a lot of our viewers today. We have several questions that have come in on the Q&A, but I want to take moderator's privilege and start with a question of my own related to the current issues with COVID. So a couple of the papers that you presented seem to have some implications for the ways in which COVID-19 has impacted the Latino community, specifically some of the work around immigration enforcement and worker engagement and the health related outcomes associated with ethnic attrition and assimilation. I'm curious, do you see any particular intersections between outcomes like job loss, virus exposure, broader economic vulnerability, and the research that you've done that may be missing from our popular discourse, but are crucial in developing an effective response to COVID-19 in the Latino community?
Yes, well, thank you for the question. Yes, I do think that, you know, this kind of, I brushed over this, but this Hispanic health paradox, which is not found on all outcomes, I'm going to say again, but you do see that, you know, surprisingly to some, that actually people who seem like they should have greater disadvantage actually have better health outcomes, right? And I think that is actually not so widely known among the broader population. And we really don't know entirely why that's true, why, you know, immigrants arriving from poor destinations might be in better health than you know, even the non-Hispanic whites in some cases, when they're certainly, you know, impoverished and lower on the SES scale. But there are some ideas that it may be something like, you know, communities and community building and certainly maybe not having as maybe being more active and other kinds of health patterns as well. I don't want to ignore those. But in particular, the COVID-19 era makes it even a little bit more paradoxical, because a lot of those kind of community notions of certainly helping people coming together are also, we're supposed to limit those kinds of things also to prevent spreading the virus. So that's why it's a little bit more nuanced, but I do think that fact is, again, suggests that we would see even bigger adverse impacts if it weren't for those kinds of sociocultural protections.
So I'm going to go now to some of the questions that have come up in the Q&A. I want to respect people's time, so I want to get in as many of these as possible. So the first question says, I'm interested in the question of the indigenous identities or experiences of Latinx immigrants and their families. Many immigrants from South America who scan as Latinx to US eyes and speak Spanish have indigenous heritage as well, but they are not from nations ancestrally located within US borders. What's the current thinking or research on this?
So the question was specifically asked about Native Americans within the United States. So some long, is that right?
So I think the question is about immigrants from South America. So in South America, the people who are indigenous to South America, not U.S. borders, yeah, of North America.
Okay.
Just a question about how.
Okay, sorry, you cut out just a little bit, but can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. So I think that this question is also asking about the race question. In part, I have done some research on the race question with respect to Native Americans as well, because I think if you're, certainly to be clear, if you identify as Hispanic, you should, you know, check Hispanic. That's what they want you to do. That's what everyone, that's what all the suggestions are. But I think on the race question, in particular for indigenous identity, I think it is much more complicated because the way the race question is asked in terms of Indigenous identity is really focused on U.S. Tribes in particular, and I think also ignores the fact that there are a lot of Indigenous communities outside of the United States that would identify racially as Indigenous, but the way the question is structured would potentially miss them unless they really explicitly go out of their way to identify it. So I would say that the problem is a little bit more reflected on the race question, but I agree that it is a problem.
So our second question, can you hear me okay now?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I changed my microphone, great. So this question asks if you can give a precise definition for each of the descriptives, or at least point someone in the direction of where they may understand these. So descriptives such as Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish that are used on census forms to sort of describe what they mean by Hispanic origin. Are there specific definitions for Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish?
Yeah, so I think that so they do give descriptions about basically in the questionnaire, and certainly historically have as well. They do give some instructions, basically talking about the Hispanic populations as essentially originating in Spanish-speaking countries. Okay, and that's why it says Spanish. Okay, because the U.S. government historically had this interest in particular in collecting data on those basically immigrants arriving from those Spanish-speaking countries in particular. That's kind of a longer story over there. But in any case, now the instructions to the question, although they do reference, these are they give lots of examples, and they say Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish are originating from those Spanish-speaking countries. It really comes down to how you identify. If you identify with that term. And so, how many people are really reading those instructions, or how many people have just accepted, whatever notion it is we have in this country about what Hispanic, Latino identity means, and that's how they're identifying. I think that is the ultimate question.
Yeah, and I will just say to those who are watching, we included the links to the previous videos, and in our second session on empirical analysis, using race and ethnicity and empirical analysis, one of our presenters there, Trevon Logan, goes into detail on the OMB definitions of each of those racial and ethnic categories. So folks can reference that as well. All right, so the next question, given the variability in how people identify, what messaging recommendations do you have for policy professionals when referring to Hispanic or Latinx statistics and data more broadly? Is it useful or important to break it out by race, if possible, as the census code does? So, for example, white, Hispanic, Black, Hispanic, etc.
So I do think it's useful. The truth is that there are also a lot of Hispanics don't even answer the race question. So that's, I think, again, an indication, and the census, it's like the Census Bureau sort of evolves with the population. Language evolves as well, right? Language is evolving. And, if I think, the more that the census, sees that people are writing in Hispanic on the race question, or if they're answering Hispanic, they just refuse to answer the race question, which also is significant. They're going to have to adapt it as well, to that potential, and that may be in a potential eventuality where they are, and on different surveys, you do see them sort of merged. And I will say, historically, in the 1930 census, Mexican was listed as a race. But again, because a lot of the history of Mexico and the United States as well. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, you know, when all of these lands were essentially transferred over to the United States, there was this kind of ultimate view, or certainly a dominant view, that that Mexicans had to be incorporated into the white population racially, but sort of distinct in some other measure. So the extent to which that actually happened varied, but there was that initiative because that's the way they sort of wanted to end up as a nation. So I think there's a lot of that history there as well.
So this question is related to, I think, where you just left off, but, and maybe you've already answered this, but, you know, there's a question about what's your understanding of why, quote unquote, Hispanic wasn't considered a race in US historically? Why was that a separate question in a sense?
So I think I think the answer would vary, but certainly in my reading of, you know, those historical sources, I think that has a lot to do with it. You know, the same. I don't want to draw too many, you know, similarities, but the same way, you know, there was a large discussion of, you know, with African Americans when states were joining the Union, if it would be a slave state or non-slave state, or all of those kinds of overlays with racial populations. I think this issue of race and how the Mexicans, so when they signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, everyone who was living in those lands was suddenly, you know, American. So the question is, how would they racially be classified? So I think we can't ignore that, you know, that question and that tension of how they were going to racially classify this suddenly much larger population that was now part of the United States.
So let's see, we have a lot of questions about ethnicity designations and terminology as it relates to the term Latinx, Hispanic, and Latino, and the connection between, you know, different terms and whether they're actually reflective of language versus some continental or national designation. I'm trying to compile these as I'm looking at them all.
So I will say this. I will say, so I started out saying really that certainly the plurality of Hispanics, right, are identifying based on country of origin, you know, so they're not necessarily going, that's certainly not Hispanic and Latino. They are certainly common terms that people are using, but they're these pan-ethnic terms, right? And if the population, you know, let's say already recognizes that there are really these important differences between, let's say, Mexican Americans and Cuban Americans, for example, then, you know, they don't adopt this pan-ethnic term to describe themselves. Even though, you know, so I will say personally, I use those terms. I certainly could identify myself that way. But, you know, I choose to adopt generally to describe myself as Mexican American because that feels most comfortable to me. And I think that kind of personal experience that people choose is really what a lot of it is going into. But I do think the term Latino has, you know, risen a lot, in part because of this language, you know, with a lot of the bilingual education movement, things like that, has gained traction. Hispanic itself, the term was, you know, I think viewed by some as sort of a term that was imposed on the population more than one that they sort of chose for themselves. And I think that all of that history is important as well. And now we will see, you know, with the Latinx term that, as we've talked about as well, does not sort of, you know, maybe you would have difficulty saying in Spanish potentially, or to identify yourself. Or recognizing that Spanish is a gendered language, those sorts of things. So it's all very nuanced.
Yes, indeed. So I'm going to see if I could pull in some other topics here in our remaining few minutes. So you mentioned the trend in the decline in fertility rates in the Latinx community. What has led to that decline? What are some of the contributing factors there?
So I think that, so I will say, at the same time that we've seen that, sometimes this isn't covered as much, but because I'm also a development economist and I do a lot of work in Mexico, the fertility rate we know that Mexicans are a large share of the Hispanic population in the United States, and the fertility rate in Mexico dropped so dramatically over one generation, really jaw-dropping. I know from certainly personal experience that, I'll say my grandmother had 10 children in Mexico, and all of her children had, maybe 2 or 3, really over one generation, dramatic. So that the change in the United States population of Hispanics, I think also mirrors that of really a dramatic drop in fertility norms. So that now you see Hispanics really almost certainly not foreign born, but certainly getting close, US born Hispanics converging on the norms of non-Hispanic whites. And it has been, as a development economist, and again, this is not just true to Mexico, really in many countries, Mexico has been one of the most dramatic. It's really amazing how much fertility has dropped in a lot of the developing world over a very short period of time.
So this is another interesting question, I think. Since Puerto Ricans are US citizens, how do you capture them as first, second, or third generation?
That is a good question. So I don't personally study Puerto Rican immigrant. Well, they're not immigrants. I don't study Puerto Rican. I think the only thing that certainly you do see a lot of research on is sort of migration from Puerto Rico to the mainland. So you see that, but I don't know that they are classified in that way, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think, as you said, the distinction that often is made is whether you are island born, if you're born on the island of Puerto Rico, or mainland born on the continent of North America in the United States as a country. Yeah. So let's see, we have a few more minutes here. So I think this is another important question to address, because you talked a bit about self-identification and how that can make it challenging to study and to analyze inequality and disparities, especially over time, as you have this ethnic attrition. Do you have thoughts or recommendations about what can be done to improve self-identification issues in surveys, in particular as it results to being able to study some of these longer term trends?
Yeah, so I think I think measuring identity based on self-identification is important. It's vitally important, and it is certainly important on the Hispanic origin type style questions. I think as I said before, I've done some work also on the Native American population. I really think there are really even bigger issues on that race question, and in particular the way American Indians or Native Americans are classified there, because it's not quite parallel in terms of their emphasis on self-identification for those two groups. But I think in general, what we would like to know is we would like to know how people self-identify, and we would also like to know their history. We would like to know, where their ancestry is from. Now, the extent to which they're going to be able to tell you, all of those, something more than where their grandparents came from, I think most people have difficulty going that far back in their own family trees, but that's ideally what we would want to know. So the extent to which we can link surveys themselves. Of course, we should ask those questions and allow people to tell us if they can, but more about ancestry, grandparents' place of birth, all of those questions. But the extent to which we can actually link surveys across countries to really potentially identify people, link censuses, that would really help us in really understanding and tracking populations and tracking progress or continuing disparities, and who is suffering from those continuing disparities, what's true about them. That would be really helpful.
I'm going to try to get to at least two more before we wrap up. There's a question here. What do you make of the overlap in increased immigration enforcement and the onset of neoliberal economics?
So I'm not sure if I see an onset of neoliberal economics. I think that's been going for a long time. But I do think that the immigration enforcement climate, has a lot to do with the changing demographics of the United States population in many ways, with the electorate also, but also with just potentially underlying tensions among different racial and ethnic groups that ends up manifested politically and ends up manifested in these kinds of policies. But I will say that it's also true that we've certainly been hearing about comprehensive immigration reform for 20 years or so, at least, about 20 years. So by my count, and we seem far from it. So the fact that we can't get there legislatively means that these kinds of policies end up being applied in this way without maybe greater thought or foresight or in that way. And so that's kind of the result of that. And hopefully that will end soon, but obviously it's also a function of political partisanship.
All right, so I think this is a slightly different question than we've addressed before. No. All right, so one more. So this is a question sort of about election results and self-identification, sort of the attrition issues that you mentioned. Do you have any thoughts about whether some of the election results maybe that people found to be surprising? You talked about there not being a monolithic Hispanic vote. Do you think some of those election results reflect some of these attrition patterns, and people who maybe, some would identify as Latinx or Latino, Hispanic, no longer identify as that? They have adopted, white as an identity, and at least racially. Do you think those results, some of the results that people may have found surprising, are consistent with your research that you've done on ethnic attrition patterns?
I think that is interesting. I have thought about looking into ethnic attrition and political participation because maybe the popular notion, certainly before this election, was that Latinos or Hispanics were largely Democratic group, right? But then I thought, well, but if you consider ethnic attrition, maybe actually they're not so much. Maybe if you considered just essentially the group defined by ancestry, maybe you would actually get a much larger share of, Hispanic Republicans, for instance, if you actually did that kind of analysis. We don't have good surveys on essentially linking those two things. What we would need would be something like, voter registration, political participation, vote patterns, and also things like your grandparents' place of birth, because that's really where we see the ethnic attrition measure. So right now what they're calling, the Latino vote is basically all by self-identification. And if we think that those people are sort of more likely to be, as with the Duncan and Trejo work, have lower educational levels or those kinds of things, then it wouldn't necessarily be manifested there. But if we could have some kind of data collection where we kind of link those two, I think there's certainly the possibility that we would find a lot more Hispanic by ancestry Republicans, for instance, than we currently think there are.
Well, I want to thank you for your time today, Francisca, and the presentation that you shared with us. This wraps up our speaker series, and we will add this recording to the other 6. I also ask that everyone stay tuned, watch for forthcoming follow-up on this series as we think about how to continue these discussions and continue to use these discussions and presentations to do better work in policy and research that is reflective of the true diversity of this country. I want to thank everyone who joined us this afternoon and wish you a good evening.